Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're reading with Jimmy, and this is Jimmy. We're reading Niccolo Machiavelli, The Prince, his famous book essay, translated by Luigi Ricci. This is part 6 of 8 parts. We've already read 5 parts, and we're going to begin this 6th part with just a slight rereading of the last chapter that we had, which was chapter 14. We started reading this in the last part, but I wanted to begin here again because it's so important. Ladies and gentlemen, chapter 14, the duties of a prince with regard to the militia. Pay attention. Remember, he's writing this to whom? To Lorenzo de' Medici, otherwise known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Why? Because he doesn't have anything to offer the prince. He doesn't have horses. He doesn't have gold. So he has knowledge. And this is a book about power, how to gain it, how to retain it, how to keep it, and how it's lost. Very, very important, especially when we do the analysis. Ready? The duties of a prince with regard to the militia. A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study but war, and its organization and discipline, for that war is the only art that is necessary to one who commands, and it is of such virtue that it not only maintains those who are born princes, but it often enables men of private fortune to attain that rank of being a prince. And one sees, on the other hand, that when princes think more of luxury than of arms, they lose their state. The chief cause of the loss of states is the contempt for this art of war, and the way to acquire them is to be well versed in the same in war. Francesco Sforza, through well-being armed, became, from a private status, he became the Duke of Milan. And his sons, through wishing to avoid the fatigue and the hardship of war, from dukes, they became private persons. In other words, they couldn't cut it. For among other evils caused by being disarmed, it renders you contemptible. These are the arrows. Remember, you're doing those arrows because those are going to be part of our analysis, and you should be taking copious notes, which is one of those disgraceful things which a prince must guard against, as will be explained later. Because there is no comparison between an armed and a disarmed man. It is not reasonable to suppose that one who is armed will obey willingly one who is unarmed, or that any unarmed man will remain safe among armed servants. You see how practical Machiavelli is? Do you understand why, if you've been reading with me for the past 5 parts, why Machiavelli is so rational? He's deadly, isn't he? Just in this little paragraph here about being armed or disarmed. For one being disdainful and the other suspicious, it is not possible for them to act well together. This is profound thinking, and you're going to say, well, Jimmy, I think, we shouldn't have guns. No. You got to think this through. What does Machiavelli say? There's no comparison between being armed and disarmed. You can't suppose that if you're armed, that anybody who's armed is going to listen to somebody who's not armed. Well, Jimmy, that doesn't mean we should all carry guns. Well, I'm not saying you should, but is this the truth? If you have a weapon and I don't have a weapon, why wouldn't I obey you? And you're not going to obey me if you've got the arms, will you? And therefore, let's continue, a prince who is ignorant of military manners, besides the other misfortunes already mentioned, cannot be esteemed by his soldiers, nor have confidence in them. So the prince ought, therefore, never to let his thoughts stray far from the exercise of war. And in peace, the prince ought to practice war more than in war. Must practice. Did you ever think you have to practice at war? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I got news for you. No matter what you do, whether it's war, whether it's purchasing, whatever your occupation, you have to practice it. Practice. You know how many free throws Michael Jordan threw every day? Which the prince can do in two ways. He can do it by action and by study. And ladies and gentlemen, therein lies a very good thought. I'm surprised Jimmy didn't write that down there. Let's mark that. You can practice by doing actions or by studying. As to action, the prince must, besides keeping his men well disciplined and exercised, he must engage continually in hunting and thus accustom his body to hardships. And meanwhile, he must learn the nature of the land and how steep the mountains are and how the valleys debouch and where the plain lies and understand the nature of rivers and swamps. And to all this, the prince should devote great attention. This knowledge is useful in two ways. In the first place, the prince learns to know the country, your country, and can better see how to defend it. And then by means of the knowledge and experience gained in one locality, the prince can easily understand any other that it may be necessary to observe. For the hills and the valleys and the plains and the rivers of Tuscany, for instance, they have a certain resemblance to those in other provinces. So that a knowledge of the country in one province can also easily arrive at the knowledge of others. This is very important. Learning, experience, transferring your knowledge. Well, Jimmy, that doesn't mean that the locality of one is the same, the structure of the land. Of course it doesn't. That's why race car drivers would always tell you to walk the track, no matter what track it is. Even if it's the same track they drove on, every race car driver worth his salt will walk the track before the race. Because what happens between the time you last raced and the race you're going to run, right? The racetrack changes. Who knows? Maybe there was a downpour. Maybe there's divots. And that the prince who is lacking in this skill is wanting in the first essentials of a leader. For it is this, knowing the land, which teaches how to find the enemy and take up quarters and lead armies and plan battles and lay siege to towns with advantage. And then he goes into an explanation here. He goes into, an example, e.g., that's how Jimmy marks examples for you. Philopomen, the prince of Archi, among the praises bestowed upon him by writers, is lauded, is really applauded, because in times of peace, he thought of nothing but the methods of warfare. And when he was in the country with his friends, he often stopped and he asked them, if the enemy were on that hill and we found ourselves here with our army, which of us would have the advantage? How could we safely approach him, maintaining our order? And if we wish to retire, what should we do? What ought we to do? And if they retreated, how should we follow them? And so he put this before them as they went along, all the contingencies. They call that today what-if scenarios. You do what-if scenarios, strategic planning, very important, that might happen to an army. Heard their opinion, he gave his own, fortifying it by argument, so that thanks to these constant reflections, ladies and gentlemen, there could never happen any incidents when actually leading his armies for which he wasn't prepared. Be prepared. Practice, 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 regardless of your trade, writing, drawing, purchasing, chemical experiments, right? If you're a chemist, practice, 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 and be prepared. But as to exercise for the mind, so he was talking about actions. Remember, he talked about actions and also study here. But as to the exercise of the mind, the prince ought to read history and study the actions of eminent men to see how they acted in warfare and examine the causes of their victories and defeats in order to imitate the former and avoid the latter. You don't want to make the same mistakes of the past. And that's one of the reasons you study history, ladies and gentlemen, and you read history and you read things, classical literature like The Prince, like Hamlet, to see how people lead their lives and how you should lead yours, but also, right, to examine them and see how they acted so you know what to avoid. And above all, do as some men have done in the past, who have imitated someone and who have been much praised and glorified, and have also kept his deeds and actions before them. As they say, Alexander the Great imitated Achilles. You should look those up if you don't know who they are. Alexander the Great probably conquered all the known world. Achilles was he was a Greek fighter in the Trojan War. Caesar Alexander, Scorpio Cyrus. And whoever reads the life of Cyrus, written by Xenophon, will perceive in the life of Scorpio how gloriously he imitated the former, and how in chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality, Scorpio conformed to those qualities of Cyrus as described by Xenophon. Pardon me. A wise prince should follow similar methods and never remain idle in peaceful times, but industriously make good use of them, so that when fortune changes, she may find him, the prince, prepared to resist her blows. He makes fortune female, and to prevail in adversity. So when your luck changes, you're ready when your luck changes. You're not caught with your pants down. You understand that saying? Don't get caught with your pants down. Practice, practice, and be prepared. I wrote a note down here about The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And I also noted after research, it's highly unlikely Machiavelli read that. I think we may read that if we haven't read it already on Reading with Jimmy, because it's one of the classics of warfare that's studied even today. There's nothing that compares to it. One of the things you'll find in Sun Tzu is studying the landscape is very, very, it's one of the key components of winning battles. And you actually, according to Sun Tzu, you win them before the first blow is struck, because you've done your homework. Very important. Besides, that text wasn't widely available. Translations were only starting to appear later, so there's no evidence that he had access to it. But he thought like Sun Tzu, or Sun Tzu thought like Machiavelli. But since Sun Tzu lived before Machiavelli, we give credit to Sun Tzu. But if you never read Sun Tzu, you're going to miss the deep, deep comparisons that I just told you about. So that's the end of that wonderful chapter on practicing. Chapter 15, of the things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. It now remains to be seen what are the methods and the rules for a prince as regards to his subjects and friends. And as I know many have written of this, I fear that my writing about it may be deemed presumptuous, differing as I do, especially in this matter, from the opinion of others. So who's he writing this to, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, Lorenzo the Magnificent. And he's telling them right up front that what I think about how a prince should treat subjects and friends is a little bit different than others have done. And it may be deemed presumptuous. You're presumptuous. Look that word up. You're presumptuous. But my intention being to write something of use to those who understand, Lorenzo, it appears to me more proper to go to the real truth of the matter than to its imagination. In other words, I don't want to make crap up. And many have imagined republics and principalities, remember those are the two organizations of society, which have never been seen or even to exist in reality. So most of the times they're pontificating and they're imagining things. For how we live, listen to this, look at the double exclamation point. Look at the double exclamation point and all these beautiful arrows. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. I cannot stress that line enough. Think about this, ladies and gentlemen. How we live, you and I. Well, Jimmy, isn't he writing this many, many years ago? Of course he is. But just think about this when he was writing it. He was saying this about his peers, about the people he lived around, not us. But if we read to learn how other people lead their lives, we have to analyze this in terms of how we live. Now think about this. How we live, how you and I live, is so far removed from how we ought to live. Do you believe that? Well, no, Jimmy, I'm living the way I want to live, the way I ought to live. I don't think that's true of anybody. Is it? Is it really? Send me an email, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com if you disagree with that. He's basically saying we're not living how we ought to live. If, for example, what he's saying now is he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done. In other words, you turn your head from reality to your, well, I want, this should be the ideal. I want to live according to the ideal. Will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservations. You're going to ruin yourself if you live in what? A dream world. You got to face reality, ladies and gentlemen. That's one of the beauties of Niccolo Machiavelli, isn't it? This guy just pours reality onto Lorenzo the Magnificent's shoulders, and he's trying to help him out. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. Can you deny the truth of that statement? Personally, I've read of only one guy who wishes to make a profession of goodness among all these people who are not good. You know who I'm talking about, right? It's very difficult when you got everybody around you who's not good. Well, Jimmy, I see there's good people. Well, then send me an email because I'd like to know where you live. Therefore, it is necessary, pay attention, for a prince who wishes to maintain himself. What does that mean? Stay a prince, to learn how not to be good. Well, Jimmy, you got to stop right there. That's BS. What do you mean you got to learn how not to be good? Pay attention. Listen, finish the sentence. This is Machiavelli telling Lorenzo de' Medici how to survive being a prince. And he's saying you have to learn, if you're going to maintain your princeness, if you're going to remain a prince, you have to learn how not to be good. Why? Well, because everybody else around you, most people, some people, doesn't matter whether it's most or some, there's people around you who are not good. And use this knowledge, right? And not use it. What does he mean, Jimmy? That's a contradiction. No, it's not. To use this knowledge and not use it according to the necessity of the case. Well, Jimmy, isn't that being two-faced? No, it's being practical. I want you to think about this. This is the theory of opposites. I'm going to pause here for 1 second. The theory of opposites means you can't know yes unless you know no. You can't know good unless you know bad. That's the theory of opposites. You can't know one unless you know what zero is. The theory of opposites. Hot, cold, anything opposite like that. Sometimes it's referred to as the yin and the yang, right? Chinese, yin yang, right? So you can't, what Machiavelli is basically saying, You got to learn not to be good. You have to learn how not, let's say you're a saint. Well, Jimmy, that's not true. You got to maintain your sainthood. You can't do anything bad. Well, you might believe that. You can believe that. But Machiavelli's telling Lorenzo, if you're going to maintain your princiness, you're going to stay a prince, the way you hold power is you got to learn not to be good when you have to, according to the necessity. Well, I don't believe that. Well, suspend your disbelief and believe it so you understand what Machiavelli's trying to tell Lorenzo. Would you do that for me? Do you mind doing that for me? Leaving on one side, then, those things which concern only an imaginary prince. And speaking of those that are real, I state that all men, and especially princes who are placed at a greater height, are reputed for certain qualities which bring them either praise or blame. So they ascend to such a height that people are going to either praise them or blame them for what? For the qualities that they possess. And don't we do that to our leaders now? Oh, he's right? You start mumbling and grumbling. Oh, look how great that person is, or look how evil that, right? Based on what? The qualities you perceive that the leader to have. So he's saying, put aside the imaginary stuff and let's look at the reality. How do you know reality? You look at the actions, not just the words. Words, you know what? Sticks and stones will hurt your bones, but names will never hurt you. You don't judge people by what they say, do you? Are you that naive? You judge people by what they do, how they act in adversity. You understand that? There's a big difference between adversity, the way you behave, including the way you behave when you're alone. Do you run from conflict or do you ride to the sound of the guns? Well, it depends how many guns are firing, Jimmy. Well, of course it does. You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Thus, one is considered liberal and another miserly. Using a Tuscan term, seeing the avaro with us means one who is rapaciously acquisitive and a miser who is grudgingly using his own. One is a free giver, another rapacious. One is cruel, another is merciful. And one is a breaker, he breaks his word, and another, he's very trustworthy. One is effeminate and pusillanimous, timid. He's timid. Another one is fierce and high-spirited. One is humane. You see, he's going through these characteristics of princes and the perception of princes by people. One is humane, another haughty, less lascivious, another chaste. You know, he's lascivious, right? He just fools around a lot. Chaste, one frank, another astute, one hard, another easy, one serious, and another frivolous, one religious, and another, and so on and so on. He gives a lot. It's a big windup, isn't it? I know that everyone will admit that it would be highly praiseworthy in a prince to possess all of the above-named qualities that are reputedly good. So if you went through this list, he's doing yin-yang, one good, one bad, one good, one bad, right? Humane, another haughty. Vivacious and chaste, frank, astute. Hard, easy. You see, he's doing, yes and no's, right? So he's saying it would be great if the prince had the good things, right? But as they cannot all be possessed or observed, human conditions not permitting it, pay attention, there's the arrow. It is necessary that he should be prudent enough. Prudent, careful. To avoid the scandal of those vices which would lose him the state. He should be smart enough and prudent enough to avoid the vices in that list that would lose him the state. And he should guard himself, if possible, against those which would not lose him. But if not able to, he can indulge them with less scruple. So some of these characteristics will lose you your state. Some won't. Some will just be opinion, which we'll talk about as perception as reality. And yet he must not mind incurring the scandal of the vices, without which it would be difficult to save the state. For if one considers well, if you think about this carefully, if you think things through, Machiavelli says, it will be found that some things which seem virtues would, if followed, lead to one's ruin, and some others, which appear to be vices, result in one's greater security and well-being. Can you think of any virtues that if you followed them, they would ruin you? Well, I can't, Jimmy. How about some vices where if you follow them, they would assure your security? Oh, I can think of some easier than I can the virtues. Could you? We're going to talk about this. If you're too good and you turn the other cheek all the time, you're not going to survive, will you? Well, you may think you'll survive, but you won't, as evidenced by what he just told you about being armed and unarmed, right? There's a difference. I'm not saying you got to go packing. I'm not saying that. Nor is he, but he's just telling you the fact of the matter is there's a difference, and you can't not deny that. You cannot deny that. And in these days, don't forget, no cell phones, no television, no nothing, right? This guy's fantastic. Chapter 16 of liberality and niggardliness. This is a stingy or meager manner. Niggardliness. Beginning how with the first qualities above named. I say that it would be well to be considered liberal. Nevertheless, liberality should, as the world understands it, is going to injure you. Who's he talking to? Lorenzo. Because if you use it virtuously, being a liberal, and in a proper way, it will not be known, and you will incur the disgrace of the contrary vice, stingy. But one who wishes to obtain the reputation of liberality among men, being liberal, being generous, you must not omit every kind of sumptuous, splendid display. Do not admit every kind. Must not omit. And to such an extent that a prince of this character will consume by such means all his resources, and will at last be compelled, if he wishes to maintain his name for liberality, to impose heavy taxes on his people. So if you're going to surround yourself with fine clothing, a lot of horses, and you start spending money, you're being very liberal. Oh, look at this. I'm giving away all my money. I'm buying you a stable, blah, blah, blah. You're going to have to impose heavy taxes on your people, and you'll become extortionate and do everything possible to obtain money. You're going to extort people, extortionate. Pardon my pronunciation. This will make his subjects begin to hate him, and he will be little esteemed being poor. So he's spending all his money. So that having by his liberality injured many and benefited few, he will feel the first little disturbance and being endangered by every peril. If he recognizes this and wishes to change his system, he incurs at once the charge of niggardliness. Stingy. He's a miser. A prince, therefore, not being able to exercise this virtue of liberality without risk, if it be known, must not, if he be prudent, object to be calling miserly. You shouldn't. So he's telling Lorenzo, well, so what if they call you a miser? Because you can't be liberal. If you go down the liberal path, you're going to lose all your money, tax people, and then they're going to hate you. So don't worry about being called a miser. In the course of time, he will be thought more liberal when it is seen by his parsimony that his revenue is sufficient that he can defend himself against those who make war on him. Doesn't have to tax people, and undertake enterprises without burdening his people, so that he is really liberal to all those from whom he does not take, and who are infinite in number, and niggardly to all whom he does not give, who are few. You know, in our times, we have seen nothing great done except by those who have been esteemed niggardly, and all others have been ruined. So you're a miser. You want to be perceived as a miser, stingy, right? Niggardly. Pope Julius II, although he had made use of a reputation for liberality, here's his example. In order to obtain the papacy, he did not seek to retain it afterwards so that he might be able to wage war. The present King of France had carried on so many wars without imposing extraordinary tax because his extra expenses were covered by the parsimony that he had so long practiced, stinginess. The present King of Spain, if he had been thought liberal, would not have engaged in or been successful in many of his enterprises. For these reasons, Lorenzo, a prince must care little for the reputation of being a miser. And if he wishes to avoid robbing his subjects, and if he wishes to be able to defend himself, to avoid becoming poor and contemptible, and not to be forced to become rapacious. This niggardliness is one of those vices which enable him to reign. Being stingy that helps you reign. And if it is said that Caesar attained the empire through liberality and that many others have reached the highest positions, Caesar Borgia, through being liberal or being thought so, I would reply that you are either a prince already or else you're on your way to becoming one. Because in the first case, this liberality is harmful. And in the second, it is certainly necessary to be considered liberal. So he's basically saying the perception should be liberal, but not, should be a miser. Caesar Borgia was one of those who wished to attain mastery over Rome. But if after attaining it, he had lived, remember, he died, and had not moderated his expenses, he would have destroyed the empire. And should anyone reply that there have been many princes who have done great things with their armies and who have been thought extremely liberal, I would answer by saying that the prince may either spend his own wealth or that of his subjects or the wealth of others. In the first case, spending his own, he must be sparing. But for the rest, he must not neglect to be very liberal. In other words, don't spend your own. Spend your subjects or the wealth of others. The liberality is very necessary to a prince, there's the arrow, who marches with his armies and lives by plunder, sack, and ransom, and is dealing with the wealth of others, for without it, he would not be followed by his soldiers. And you may be very generous indeed with what is not the property of yourself or your subjects, as were Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander. For, note the arrow, spending the wealth of others will not diminish your reputation, but will only increase your reputation. Because only by spending your own resources will injure you. There's nothing which destroys itself so much as liberality, for by using it, you lose your power of using it. Pay attention, for by using it, liberality, you lose the power of using it. I cannot imagine a more perfect sentence. By using liberality, you lose the power of using liberality. I should diagram this for you. And become either poor or despicable, or to escape poverty, rapacious and hated. And of all the things that a prince must guard against, the most important are being despicable or hated. And liberality will lead you to one or other of these conditions. So it is therefore wiser to have the name of miser, which produces disgrace without hatred, than to incur the necessity of a name of being rapacious, which produces both disgrace and hatred. Right? Chapter 17. Of cruelty and clemency, and whether it is better to be loved or feared. Chapter 17, ladies and gentlemen, one of the most famous chapters in The Prince. Most people, when they refer to The Prince, they often quote this chapter. Should you be loved or feared? Pay attention. Look at all the arrows. Oh, holy mackerel. Isn't this unbelievable? Okay, proceeding to the other qualities before named, in other words, going back to those qualities that he named, I say that every prince must desire to be considered merciful and not cruel. He must, however, take care not to misuse this mercifulness. Pay attention. You must be considered, he's writing Lorenzo, be merciful and not cruel. Caesar Borgia was considered cruel, but his cruelty had brought order to the Romagna, united it, and reduced it to peace and fidelity. If this is considered well, it will be seen that he was, right, really much more merciful than the Florentine people, who, to avoid the name of cruelty, they allowed Pistoia to be destroyed. A prince, therefore, must not mind incurring the charge of cruelty, for the purpose of keeping his subjects united and faithful. For, with a very few examples, he will be more merciful than those who, from excess of tenderness, allow disorders to arise, from whence spring bloodshed and rapine. For these, as a rule, injure the whole community, while the executions carried out by the prince injure only individuals. For these, as a rule, injure the whole community, right? While executions carried out by the prince injure only an individual. And of all princes, it is impossible for a new prince to escape the reputation of cruelty, new states being always full of dangers. Wherefore Virgil, through the mouth of Dido, says, Virgil, right, is a Roman writer. He's a Roman writer who wrote, Dido. Res dura et ragni novitas me talia cuniat morale et lat fines custodi tuere. Excuse my Latin pronunciation. Hard things and the newness of the kingdom compel me to do such things to grind and to protect the frontiers wisely. That's roughly translated. Nevertheless, Machiavelli continues, he must be cautious, the prince, in believing and acting, and must not be afraid of his own shadow. And he must proceed in a temperate manner with prudence and humanity, so that not too much confidence does not render him incautious, and too much diffidence does not render him intolerant. This is a very balanced paragraph. In other words, find your balance, Prince. And from this arises the question whether it is better to be loved more than feared or feared more than loved. The reply is one ought to be both feared and loved, but as it is difficult for the two to go together, it is much safer to be feared than loved, if one of the two ways has to be wanting. You thought when I first started reading the sentence that he's going to cop out and say you got to be both, but he doesn't. He says it's better to be feared. So now you know when you're talking to other people, if you start talking about the prince and you ask them, is it better to be feared or loved? And they say love, they didn't read the prince, right? For it may be said of men in general, pay attention, look at this arrow, that they are ungrateful, voluble, dissemblers, and anxious to avoid danger and covetous of gain. You think? As long as you benefit them, they are entirely yours, and they offer you their blood, their goods, their life, and their children, as I have said, when the necessity is remote. But when necessity approaches, they revolt. And the prince who has relied solely on their words without making other preparations, like being feared, is ruined. For the friendship which is gained by purchase and not through grandeur and nobility of spirit is bought but not secured. And at a pinch, it is not expended in your service. Pardon me. And men have less scruple in offending one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. You pay attention. Men have less scruple in offending someone who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. For love is held by a chain of obligation, which men, being selfish, is broken whenever it serves their purpose. But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment, which never fails. You should think about this. You should think about this in the discipline of children, in the discipline of employees, in the discipline of students in school. Is it better to be loved or feared? Think about this. Well, I think we should all be loved. Well, that's great. Of course, it's ideal, but it's not the case. I saw a situation today in the store. Okay. Kids running into the store and just running rampant. And the parents were chasing them like it was a game. Running, throwing stuff off shelves. It was embarrassing. Of course, Jimmy, what did you do? Well, it's not my kid. Not only that, if you insert yourself into a situation today, you never know what's going to happen, right? So we basically just watched for a while and then left. Or they left, I forgot which. Still, a prince should make himself feared in such a way that he does not gain love. If he does not gain love, he avoids hatred. Think about your children. You should make yourself feared in such a way that if you don't gain love, you don't gain hatred. You avoid hatred. You don't want your kids to hate you. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? It's a delicate balance. I could tell you some stories of Jimmy growing up, when he was young, which I may do in the analysis. We'll see. Because I got an arrow here. We're going to talk about this. For fear and the absence of hatred may go well together, and will always be attained by one who abstains from interfering with the property of his citizens and subjects or with their women. One of the ways my parents used to control us is by taking away our allowance. We used to get we'd get a quarter a week in those days. There's a lot of money. You can buy some good candy for a quarter. But if we misbehaved, it was sometimes a nickel off your allowance. It hurt. It hurt. Especially when you lost the whole quarter. And when he is obliged to take the life of anyone, look at this. He's obliged to take the life of anyone. Execute. Let him do so when there is proper justification and manifest reason for it. But above all, he must abstain from taking the property of others. For men forget more easily the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. Is that true? Is that true? Property over people? What's the fire codes in the United States? Property or people? Save people, right? But they really, if you look closely, they're written to save the property, right? If you look closely at fire codes, they want to save people, but they're written in many cases to save the property. You want to try to save the property. They won't say that overtly. Then also pretexts for seizing property are never wanting, and one who begins to live by rapine, R-A-P-I-N-E, the violent seizure of someone's property, rapine, almost where the word rape comes from, right? Will always find some reason for taking the goods of others, whereas causes for taking life are rarer and more fleeting. Arrow. But when the prince is with his army and has a large number of soldiers under his control, then it is extremely necessary that he should not mind being thought cruel. Why? Because he's got the army. For without this reputation, he couldn't keep an army united or disposed to any duty. Among the noteworthy, actions of Hannibal in numbered is this, that although he had an enormous army composed of men of all stations and fighting in foreign countries, there never arose any dissension among either them or against the prince, either in good fortune or in bad. And this could not be due to anything but his inhumane cruelty, which together with his infinite other virtues, he calls cruelty a virtue, made him always venerated and terrible in the sight of his soldiers. And without it, his other virtues would not have sufficed to produce that effect. E.g., the example is Hannibal, right? Thoughtless writers admire, on the one hand, Hannibal's actions, and on the other, they blame the principal cause of his actions, which is really, what is it? His inhumane cruelty. Did you know Hannibal was an inhumane, cruel man? And that is true of his other virtues, though would not have sufficed to control his army, may be seen in the case of Scipio, famous not only in regard to his own times, but all times in which memory remains, whose armies rebelled against Scipio in Spain, which rose from nothing but his excessive kindness, which allowed more license to his soldiers than was consonant with the military discipline. And he was reproached with this in the Senate by Fabius Maximus, who called him a corrupter of Roman militia. He was too easy. Lorchi, having been destroyed by one of Scipio's officers, was not revenged by Scipio, nor was the insolence of that officer punished simply by reason of his easy nature. So much so that someone wishing to excuse him in the Senate said that there were many men who knew rather how not to err than how to correct the errors of others. And this disposition would in time have tarnished the fame and glory of Scipio, had he persevered in it under the empire. But living under the rule of the Senate, this harmful quality of too much kindness was not only concealed, but it was became a glory to him. And I conclude, therefore, with regard to being feared and loved, that men love at their own free will, but fear at the will of the prince. And that a wise prince must rely on what is in his power and not what is in the power of others. And he must only contrive and avoid incurring hatred, as has been explained. One of the most famous chapters that we've read. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. Aren't you enjoying this? We're reading part 6 of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. They're all on this website. We're going to analyze it. If you finish with me and enjoy, you will enjoy the analysis. It'll be extended because it's a long book. And I thank you so much for your time. Remember, time is the only non-renewable resource. And if you're spending it with me, reading with me, we really, really appreciate it. I certainly do. And remember, if you have questions, I'd like you to email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. And don't forget, we're also on YouTube. Yes, we are. You can find us Reading with Jimmy on YouTube. You can go directly there and get all these videos instead of going to the website. But our website is readingwithjimmy.com, readingwithjimmy.com. And when you click there, you can also click right into the YouTube thing. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the day. Remember, pay attention. This is important.